The die is cast. We must fight for our liberties, or we will be forever slaves.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something truly monumental. We're looking at the origin story of the United States.
It's great to be here.
And I want to be clear right from the start. If you're coming here for a clean, simple story about a bunch of guys in wigs signing a paper, well, this isn't that.
No, not at all. The reality, when you actually dig into the sources, the timelines from the Library of Congress, the National Park Service records, it's anything but clean.
It's messy, it's chaotic, and honestly, it feels like a total miracle it even worked.
It really does. The story we usually get, it's so streamlined, it feels inevitable. But when you focus on that critical window, say 1775 to 1777, you see just how fragile it all was.
That's the key, isn't it? The fragility. We're talking about a loose collection of colonies with no real army, no central government, no money.
And they decided to take on the world's greatest military superpower.
It's the ultimate David versus Goliath story.
And even that might be giving the Americans too much credit. I mean, David knew how to use his slingshot. The colonies barely had any gunpowder.
So that's our mission for this deep dive, to unpack that chaos, to get into that transition from, disgruntled British subjects to a nation fighting for its life.
Exactly, and to explore the psychology of it. How do you convince a population that's mostly proud to be British to commit treason? Because let's be clear, that's what it was.
Treason, yeah. And we also need to talk about the people who are usually left out of this story.
Absolutely. The roles of enslaved people, of Native Americans, they are pivotal. And the choices they had to make were, frankly, heartbreaking.
And we can't forget the blunders, the mistakes.
Oh, the blunders are maybe the most important part of the story. Both sides made them, but the British mistakes, well, they were empire-altering.
Okay, let's set the stage. We're dropping into April 1775. But to get why the powder keg explodes, we have to rewind just a little bit to 1774 and these things called the Intolerable Acts.
Right. You have to understand, Parliament in London is furious, absolutely livid about the Boston Tea Party.
They saw it as vandalism, pure and simple, destruction of property.
Millions of dollars in today's money. So they decide to make an example of Massachusetts. And these acts are designed to be punitive. They're designed to hurt.
So what do they do, specifically?
First, they close the port of Boston. Just shut it down.
Well, for a city like Boston, a port city, that's an economic death sentence.
It strangled them. No goods in, no goods out. Then they fundamentally changed the colonial government. They banned most town meetings.
So they're taking away their right to assemble to govern themselves.
Exactly. And then you have the Quartering Act, which is the one everyone sort of remembers from school.
The one about soldiers living in your house.
It was a bit more complicated technically about housing them in unused buildings, but the fear, the perception, was that redcoats could be forced into your home at any time. It created this feeling of a military occupation.
So the city is economically crippled and feels like it's under military siege by its own government.
Precisely, and that's the context for the Minutemen. These weren't professional soldiers. You have to picture farmers, blacksmiths, merchants drilling on the village green.
Training to be ready at a minute's notice.
That's the idea. But here's the crucial detail that so often gets lost. In early 1775, they were not fighting for independence.
Really? I always assumed armed resistance meant they wanted out.
Not yet. If you'd asked one of them, he would have said he was fighting for his rights as an Englishman. They saw themselves as loyal subjects whose rights were being trampled by a corrupt parliament, not a tyrannical king.
They still had faith in the king. They thought he'd step in and fix it.
That was the hope. They weren't thinking about a United States. They were thinking about a return to how things were.
Okay, so they're armed, they're angry, but they're still technically loyal. That brings us to the spark. April 19th, 1775, Lexington and Concord.
General Gage, the British commander in Boston, is in an impossible position. He knows the colonists are stockpiling weapons and ammunition out in the countryside. He gets orders from London, disarm them, arrest leaders.
Specifically Sam Adams and John Hancock.
Those were the main targets. So he puts together a plan. Under the cover of darkness, he sends a column of about 700 regulars to march to Concord to seize the stash.
But it wasn't exactly a secret operation, was it?
Not at all. The rebel intelligence network was incredible. Paul Revere, William Dawes, Samuel Prescott, they all ride out. The famous 1 if by land, 2 if by sea signal is lit in the Old North Church. The countryside is awake and arming itself.
So by the time the British get to Lexington Green at dawn...
They're met by about 70 men from the local militia, just standing there.
And this is where history gets murky. The shot heard round the world. Who fired it?
We still don't know, and we probably never will. The British officers shouted at them to disperse. The American captain, John Parker, actually told his men to stand down, but in the confusion, a shot rang out.
And all hell broke loose.
The British regulars fired a volley. 8 Americans were killed on the green. The British then marched on to Concord.
Did they find the weapons?
Almost nothing. The colonists had been tipped off and had moved everything hours before, so the British turned around to march back to Boston. And that's when their day went from bad to a complete nightmare.
This is the famous running battle.
It was 16 miles of hell for them. By now, thousands of militiamen from all the surrounding towns had converged. They weren't lining up in a field, they were hiding behind stone walls, trees, barns.
Guerrilla warfare.
Classic guerrilla tactics. They just picked that bright red column apart all the way back to Boston.
Casualties must have been shocking for the British.
They were. Nearly 300 killed, wounded, or missing. But the psychological impact was even bigger. The news, as the sources say, just rocketed down the eastern seaboard.
So this wasn't just a Boston problem anymore.
Not even close. Within days, thousands of volunteers from all over New England were marching to Cambridge to Boston. They surrounded the city and trapped the British Army inside.
So in 24 hours, you go from a political argument to a full-blown siege.
Exactly. This is the birth of what would become the Continental Army. We've moved from pamphlets to bloodshed. Even if they don't know it yet, the war has begun. There's no turning back.
Which brings us to the first real pitched battle a couple of months later, June 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Which, as you noted from the sources, mostly took place on Breed's Hill.
Right. Why did we get that wrong?
It's just one of those quirks of history. The orders were for Bunker Hill. It was the more strategic point. But the officer on the ground, Colonel Prescott, decided Breed's Hill, being closer to the city, was a more direct threat to the British. So they dug in there overnight.
And the British wake up in the morning and see this. What, a dirt fort?
Right.
Right on their doorstep.
A dirt fort, exactly. And the British commander, General Howe, is just insulted. He sees this as an affront by a bunch of peasants. His whole mindset is, we are the British Army. We will march up that hill in perfect formation and sweep them off.
It sounds like pure arrogance.
It was. He could have just used his ships to bombard them from the rear and cut them off. It would have been easy. But he wanted to teach them a lesson in British military might.
A frontal assault.
Wow.
In broad daylight.
Uphill. Through waist-high grass and fences. And the sources mention the heat. It was a sweltering day. Those poor soldiers were carrying 60-pound packs, wearing heavy wool uniforms.
They must have been exhausted before they even got to the fight.
Absolutely exhausted. Meanwhile, the Americans are waiting in their trenches. But they have a huge problem.
Ammunition.
They are desperately low on gunpowder. This is where we get that legendary command, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes.
I always thought that was just a line about being brave.
It was pure practical necessity. Their muskets were so inaccurate, firing from a distance was just a waste of powder. They had to let this professional army get terrifyingly close, maybe 50 yards, to make every single shot count.
I cannot imagine the discipline that took.
It's incredible. But they held their fire. And when the British got into range and the Americans finally let loose, the first rank of the British assault just evaporated. It ceased to exist.
Wow.
The survivors broke and ran back down the hill. The British officers had to basically kick them to get them to reform for a second assault.
And the second assault.
Same result. Another devastating volley, another bloody retreat down the hill.
But the British did eventually take the hill.
On the third try, by then, the Americans were out of ammunition. It became a fight with rocks and the butts of their muskets. They had to retreat. So on paper, it's a British victory. They achieved their objective.
But the cost, the numbers in the sources are just staggering.
Of the 2,200 British troops who saw action, over 1,000 were killed or wounded, a nearly 50% casualty rate. One British general wrote afterwards, "The loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. It shattered them."
So tactically a loss for the Americans, but strategically.
A massive psychological victory. It's like a rookie boxer who goes 10 rounds with the heavyweight champ. He might lose on points, but he proved the champ could be hit. The aura of British invincibility died on that hill.
Okay, so the war is raging in New England. It feels, at this point, very localized. But the conflict was much bigger. We have to pivot to the South.
Yes, this is absolutely critical to understanding the full scope of the war. While all this is happening in Massachusetts, things are coming to a boil in Virginia.
And this involves the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, and a decision he makes that sends a shockwave through the colonies.
In November of 1775, Dunmore issues his famous proclamation. He's desperate. The rebels are gaining power in Virginia, so he declares martial law and he makes an offer.
Freedom for enslaved people.
Yes, but with a huge catch. He offered freedom to any enslaved person belonging to a rebellious American who could escape to British lines and agree to fight for the king.
Okay, that's a really important distinction. If your owner was a loyalist, you were out of luck.
You stayed in bondage. This was not an abolitionist crusade, let's be very clear about that. It was a military tactic. It was designed to disrupt the colonial economy and to raise troops. It was cynical.
But for an enslaved person, the motive doesn't matter as much as the opportunity.
Not at all. The promise of freedom was everything. And the sources say tens of thousands of African Americans flocked to the British lines over the course of the war. They formed their own units, like the Royal Ethiopian Regiment.
And I saw a note that on their uniforms they wore a sash.
Yes. Inscribed with the words, "Liberty to slaves."
Liberty to slaves. Think about that image. The British Army, the supposed tyrants, have a regiment of former slaves fighting for them with that slogan on their chests.
It completely complicates the simple narrative of patriots fighting for freedom. Whose freedom are we talking about? It's a stark contradiction.
So how did this play out for the British? Did the strategy work?
Well, yes and no. It certainly caused chaos for the Patriots. But politically, it backfired spectacularly.
How so?
In the South, you had a lot of wealthy planters who were on the fence about independence. They were doing just fine under the British system. But the one thing that terrified them more than anything was the idea of an armed slave rebellion.
And Dunmore basically just armed their slaves.
He armed their greatest fear. And that act pushed thousands of those Southern fence-sitters firmly into the Patriot camp. For them, the revolution became a war to preserve their way of life, to preserve the institution of slavery.
So a British military tactic actually helped unite the colonies against them.
In a powerful, if deeply ironic way.
Yes. And it wasn't just enslaved people being drawn into this. The sources make a big point about Native American involvement.
Yes, another incredibly complex and tragic part of the story. For the most part, the majority of tribes sided with the British.
Which makes sense. The colonists were the ones constantly pushing west, taking their land.
Exactly. The British Crown had at least tried, with things like the Proclamation of 1763, to set a boundary. The British were seen as a buffer against unstoppable colonial expansion. So you see Cherokee warriors attacking the frontier in 1776. You see leaders like Joseph Brant of the Mohawks becoming key British allies.
But the sources also mention a civil war within one of the most powerful groups, the Iroquois Confederacy.
The Haudenosaunee, or the Six Nations, this was a political alliance that had existed for centuries. It was incredibly sophisticated. But the revolution just tore them apart.
Brother against brother.
Literally.
Yeah.
The Mohawks, Senecas, Cayugas, and Onondagas mostly sided with the British. But two nations, the Oneida and the Tuscarora, sided with the Americans.
Why would they do that, given the threat of expansion?
It was complicated. It had to do with local relationships, the influence of certain missionaries. But the result was the breaking of their Great League. Iroquois warriors fought each other at battles like Oriskany. The central council fire of the Confederacy was extinguished. It was a tragedy from which they never fully recovered.
It just hammers home that this was so many different wars happening all at once.
It really was. And while these larger forces are at play, we're also seeing these crucial regional battles that give the Patriots hope. Let's go back to the South. Early 1776.
Okay, the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in North Carolina. This wasn't Patriots versus Redcoats.
No, this was Patriot versus Loyalist, American versus American. A force of Loyalists, mostly made up of recent Scottish Highland immigrants, was trying to march to the coast to link up with the British.
So you have these fierce Highland warriors.
Fierce warriors, yes. Their plan was a classic Highland charge with broadswords across this narrow bridge.
Sounds terrifying.
It would have been.
Yeah.
But the Patriots did something ingenious. The night before, they pulled up most of the wooden planks on the bridge, leaving just the two narrow log beams that supported them.
A trap?
And then, this detail is amazing, they greased the log beams with soap and tallow.
You're kidding.
Not at all. So when the Loyalists launched their charge in the pre-dawn darkness, they hit the bridge, started slipping and sliding, and the Patriots, hidden on the other side, just opened up on them with muskets and cannons. The battle was over in minutes.
A gruesome but brilliant tactic.
And incredibly effective. The sources say this one small battle crushed Loyalist sentiment in the Carolinas for the next 3 years. It secured the region for the Patriots.
And then, just a few months later, in June of '76, Another huge Southern victory, the defense of Charleston.
This is a fantastic story. The British sent a huge fleet to capture Charleston, South Carolina, which was one of the wealthiest cities in America. They focused their attack on a small, unfinished fort on Sullivan's Island.
A fort made of sand and logs.
Sand and palmetto logs. The British admiral was confident his warships would blow it to splinters in half an hour.
But he didn't count on the palmetto logs.
He had no idea. The wood of the palmetto tree is not brittle, it's soft and spongy. So when the British cannonballs hit the fort, they didn't shatter the walls, they just sort of thudded into the logs and got stuck.
Like shooting a cannon at a sponge cake.
Exactly. The fort just absorbed the punishment all day. Meanwhile, the American cannons were doing serious damage to the British warships, which were also struggling in the harbor's tricky currents. The fleet eventually had to retreat in humiliation.
And that victory bought the South years of security.
It did. It kept the British out of the Deep South until much later in the war. And these wins at Moores Creek and Charleston were hugely important. They built confidence. They gave the Continental Congress in Philadelphia the political breathing room they needed to take the next monumental step.
The point of no return, July 1776.
But before we get to the Declaration itself, we have to talk about a pamphlet.
Thomas Paine's Common Sense.
Published in January 1776, and it was the 18th century equivalent of going viral. It sold over 100,000 copies in just a few months.
In a country 2.5 million people, that's an incredible number. Why was it so effective?
Because Paine didn't write like a lawyer or philosopher. He wrote in plain, angry, powerful language for the common person. He attacked the very idea of monarchy. He called King George III a royal brute. He just said, look, it's absurd for a tiny island to rule a vast continent. It's common sense that we should be independent.
So he shifted the entire frame of the debate.
He shattered it. He made the idea of independence, which had been a radical fringe idea just months before, seem like the only logical path forward.
Which leads us to Philadelphia, the Second
Yeah.
Continental Congress, July 4th, 1776.
The adoption of the Declaration of Independence. And this document represents a massive ideological shift. They're no longer arguing for the rights of Englishmen.
Now they're talking about natural rights.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Rights that come from a creator, not a king. It's pure Enlightenment thinking, and it universalizes their cause.
But we have to talk about the great glaring contradiction at the heart of it. All men are created equal.
Written by a man, Thomas Jefferson, who owned over 100 people. It's the central hypocrisy of the founding, and there's no way around it.
It's hard to reconcile.
It is, and people at the time saw it. One English abolitionist wrote something like, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?"
Wow.
The truth is, for the men in that room, all men meant white, property-owning men. But, and this is a huge but, by writing those words down, they created a creed, an ideal, a promissory note, as Martin Luther King Jr. would later call it, that they couldn't control.
They set a standard that future generations could then use to hold the nation to account.
Exactly. The fight for abolition, for women's suffrage, for civil rights, all of those movements would point back to that sentence, so its power ended up being far greater than its author's original intent.
So independence is declared. The colonies are now states. It must have felt like the beginning of the end.
It felt like a triumph. But then, in reality, it was the end of the beginning. The military situation was about to go from bad to catastrophic.
The empire strikes back.
With a vengeance. While Congress was debating in Philadelphia, the British were assembling a massive invasion force off New York. We're talking 32,000 professional soldiers, British regulars and German Hessians, and a fleet of 400 ships.
It was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent anywhere.
By far. And George Washington, with his tiny, inexperienced army, somehow has to defend New York City, an island, against the greatest navy on Earth.
An impossible task.
Militarily, it was hopeless. In August 1776, at the Battle of Brooklyn, the British completely outmaneuvered him. It was the largest battle of the entire war, and it was a total unmitigated disaster for the Americans.
Washington's army was almost wiped out.
They were trapped, backed up against the East River. If the British had pressed their advantage that afternoon, they could have captured Washington and his entire army. The war would have been over. Right there.
So what happened? Why didn't they?
General Howe was cautious, maybe overconfident. He decided to wait until morning to finish them off. And then a miracle, a literal act of God. A thick fog rolled in overnight. An impossibly thick fog. And under its cover, using a bunch of fishermen from Marblehead, Massachusetts, who knew how to handle boats, Washington managed to evacuate his entire army, 9,000 men, their horses, their cannons, across the river to Manhattan.
Without the British even noticing.
They had no idea until the sun burned the fog off and they were gone. It was America's Dunkirk moment. A miraculous escape, but still a devastating defeat.
And it was just the beginning of a long retreat.
A nightmare retreat. The British chased them out of New York City, then all the way across New Jersey. This is the absolute low point of the war. Thomas Paine, who was marching with the army, wrote his famous pamphlet, The American Crisis, on a drumhead by a campfire.
These are the times that try men's souls.
That's the one, because the army was just melting away. Enlistments were set to expire on December 31st. Men were deserting. The British were offering pardons to anyone who would swear allegiance to the king, and thousands were taking them.
Even Washington thought it was over.
He wrote to his brother, "I think the game is pretty near up." He retreats across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in December, with maybe a few thousand frozen, starving men left. The rebellion is on the brink of total collapse.
And this is where he makes his desperate gamble.
The most desperate gamble of the war. It's Christmas night, 1776. His army will cease to exist in a week. He needs a victory, any victory, to restore hope. So he plans a suicidal-sounding mission.
To cross the frozen Delaware River, go back into New Jersey, and attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton.
In the middle of a blizzard, no less. A vicious nor'easter blows in. It's snowing, sleeting, the river is choked with huge chunks of ice.
And the state of his men.
They're in rags, many don't have shoes. There are contemporary accounts of the army's path being marked by bloody footprints in the snow.
That's just a horrifying image.
It is. The password for the night was victory or death. There was no other option.
So they crossed the river. The famous painting of Washington standing heroically
is a bit of a fantasy. He was probably huddled against the cold while those Marblehead fishermen used long poles to push the ice floes away from their boats. It was a brutal, terrifying crossing that took hours longer than planned.
But they make it.
They make it. They march 9 miles through the snow and attack Trenton at dawn on December 26th. The Hessians are completely surprised.
Was it true they were all drunk from Christmas?
That's mostly a myth. They were exhausted from constant patrols, but they were not expecting an attack in a blizzard. The battle was short, sharp, and a stunning American victory. They captured nearly 1,000 Hessians and vital supplies with almost no losses of their own.
It must have been an incredible morale boost.
It was life support for the revolution, and then a week later, Washington did it again. He won another clever victory at Princeton on January 3rd.
So, in the space of 10 days, he snatches 2 victories from the jaws of absolute defeat.
And it changes everything. Not the map, necessarily. The British still hold New York. But it changes the psychology. It convinced soldiers to re-enlist. It convinced the public that the war wasn't lost. It saved the Continental Army.
Which allows them to survive into 1777, the year that becomes the great turning point of the war.
The turning point. And it all hinges on a massive British strategic blunder.
It seems to always come back to that.
It does. The British devise what looks like a war-winning plan on paper. General John Burgoyne will lead an army south from Canada, another force will move east from the Great Lakes, and General Howe will bring his main army north from New York City.
And they'll all meet at Albany.
Exactly. They would control the entire Hudson River Valley, which would cut New England, the heart of the rebellion, off from the rest of the states. Game over.
A brilliant plan. What went wrong?
General Howe, he just doesn't do it.
What do you mean?
He decides he has a better idea. Instead of going north to help Burgoyne, he decides he wants the glory of capturing the American capital, Philadelphia. So he puts his entire army on ships and sails south.
He just leaves Burgoyne hanging out to dry.
Completely. And he captures Philadelphia, but it's a hollow victory. Congress just packs up and moves. It doesn't end the war. But what it does do is leave Burgoyne's army all alone, deep in the hostile wilderness of upstate New York.
And his supply lines must have been stretched incredibly thin.
To the breaking point. And the further south he gets, the more the American militia swarms around him like angry bees. He's bogged down, losing men in skirmishes, and there's no help coming.
This leads to Saratoga.
The battles of Saratoga in September and October of 1777, the American army, now under General Horatio Gates, finally stops Burgoyne, surrounds him, and cuts off his retreat.
And on October 17th,
Burgoyne surrenders his entire army. Almost 6,000 professional soldiers lay down their arms. It was an unthinkable victory for the Americans. It shocked the world.
But it did more than just shock people. It got the attention of one country in particular,
France.
who had been waiting for a reason to get back at Britain.
Exactly. The French hated the British and had been secretly sending some aid to the Americans. But they weren't going to officially ally themselves with a losing cause. They needed proof that the Americans could actually win a major conventional battle.
And Saratoga was that proof.
Saratoga was the proof of concept. Benjamin Franklin is in Paris, working his diplomatic magic, and the news of Saratoga gives him the leverage he needs. In February 1778, France signs a formal treaty of alliance with the United States.
And that changes everything.
It transforms the war. It's no longer a colonial rebellion. It's now a global conflict. Britain has to defend against the French Navy in the English Channel and the Caribbean and India. They have to pull troops and ships away from America to protect the rest of their empire.
It levels the playing field.
It gives America a fighting chance. There's still a long, hard road ahead. The brutal winter at Valley Forge is next, then a bloody shift in strategy to the south. But the French alliance is what ultimately makes the victory at Yorktown in 1781 possible.
And that leads to the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and official independence.
The end of a very long road.
So looking back at this entire chaotic period from 75 to the end of 77, what's the big takeaway for you when you put all these sources together?
For me, it's the sheer contingency of it all, the fragility. We look back and draw these clean lines, but it could have gone the other way at a dozen different moments.
If the fog doesn't roll in at Brooklyn,
if Washington doesn't risk everything on that Christmas crossing, if Howe had just followed his orders and marched north to meet Burgoyne, any one of those things changes, and the United States likely doesn't exist. It becomes a failed footnote in the history of the British Empire.
it really makes you realize that nations aren't just declared. They're forged through these moments of incredible desperation and sometimes just dumb luck.
Absolutely. And that leads to the final thought I'd want you, the listener, to really grapple with. We call it the American Revolution, singular, but it was so many things. It was a civil war, loyalist against patriot. It was a world war, and it left so much unresolved.
The unfinished business.
Exactly. The revolution established these breathtaking ideals on paper. All men are created equal. But the reality in 1783 fell so far short of that ideal. The fight to apply those principles to everyone, to women, to enslaved people, to Native Americans, that fight didn't end at Yorktown.
In many ways, that's a revolution that is still going on.
We are still, as a country, trying to live up to the promise that was written down in 1776. That's the enduring legacy of this messy, bloody, improbable story.
A really powerful way to frame it. This has been fascinating. I feel like I understand the sheer chaos of it all so much better.
That's always the goal.
If you want to dive into these documents yourself, and I really recommend it, the Library of Congress and the National Park Service have amazing online resources. Reading the actual letters from soldiers, it just brings it all to life.
It really does.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. Keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.